The Eastern Front of the Second World War was a titanic military conflict between the world's two most powerful totalitarian states, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Over the course of 4 years, armies of millions of men and thousands of tanks and aircraft fought over a battlefield extending thousands of miles, from the Baltic in the north to the Black Sea in the south, and from the Volga in the east to the Elbe in the west. While the Eastern Front has long been the subject of scholarly and popular attention, major questions remain to be addressed. In this video series, I shall consider two major questions. First, how many casualties were there on the Eastern Front? Recent archival work has provided critical new evidence overturning older figures and indicating that the Eastern Front was more deadly than previously thought. This has implications for assessments of the relative effectiveness of the major combatants, as well as for appraisals of the critical factors in determining the outcome of the conflict. Second, how close did Germany come to victory in the East? In particular, could Germany have defeated the Soviet Union even after the failure of Operation Barbarossa? Many scholars and commentators have long argued that the failure of the German invasion of 1941 to achieve its objectives meant that Germany would have been unable to achieve victory against the greater combined manpower and industrial capacity of the Allies, particularly the Soviet Union supported by the United States. Traditionally, however, these claims have been based on highly subjective intuitions and personal hunches, with no clear methodology for validating such counterfactuals and determining what could plausibly have happened based on objective methods. In this first video, I will present a novel dataset containing estimates of German and Soviet losses, personnel strength, tank strengths, and manpower reserves for every month of the war in the East. In the second video in the series, I will use this dataset to develop and implement a computer simulation of the Eastern Front, which permits a more rigorous quantitative analysis of various counterfactuals. My results indicate that, contrary to common belief, the Soviet Union came very close to defeat owing to near depletion of its manpower reserves around the middle of 1943. Three key factors that ensured Soviet victory were the failure of the Germans to properly mobilize and prepare for their initial invasion in 1941, the disastrous and unexpected German defeat at Stalingrad, and the increasing diversion of German manpower and equipment away from the Eastern Front to combat the Western Allies from late 1942 onwards. Before examining this statistical data I've compiled, we will first review the history of the campaigns on the Eastern Front. The conflict began on the 22nd of June 1941 with the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. 3 army groups smashed through the Soviet forces and advanced thousands of miles into Soviet territory in the space of only a few months. Despite tremendous Soviet casualties and rapid German advances, the Germans were unable to achieve their objectives of capturing Leningrad and Moscow. In the subsequent winter counteroffensive, the Soviet forces pushed the Germans hundreds of miles back from Moscow while continuing to build up their force strength to over 5 million. In the spring of 1942, the Germans again launched a counteroffensive, this time in the south, aimed at capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus. Once again, however, the Germans made rapid advances but were unable to reach their objectives. At the end of 1942, German forces in the city of Stalingrad were cut off and surrounded by the Soviets, forcing the Germans to retreat from the Caucasus and resulting in the greatest German defeat of the war, when in early 1943 an entire army was forced to surrender in Stalingrad. Both sides spent the next several months rebuilding their forces before, in the summer of 1943, the Germans launched their third and final major offensive of the war in the east, aimed at surrounding Soviet forces concentrated near the city of Kursk. However, the Soviets were well prepared for the offensive and were able to weather the German assault before themselves going on the offensive. From this point on, the Soviets dictated the course of the conflict. In a series of advances, they were able to push the Germans back hundreds of miles to the Dnieper River, even gaining some bridgeheads over the river by late 1943. In the early months of 1944, the Soviets were able to use these bridgeheads to continue their advance into the western Ukraine, and by the end of the year were able to retake most of the Ukraine. Now outnumbering the Germans more than 2-1, the Soviets launched 2 major offensives in the summer of 1944. The first, Operation Bagration, completely destroyed German Army Group Center in Belarus and brought the Soviets up to the Polish border. The second was an offensive south into the Balkans, which led to both Romania and Bulgaria switching sides, and forced the Germans to evacuate from Greece and much of Yugoslavia. By December 1944, the Germans had been forced back to the border of the Reich across almost the entire Eastern Front. The Oder and Vienna offensives of early 1945 saw the Soviets smash through the German defenses in East Germany and Austria, bringing the Soviet armies within reach of the very heart of Germany. The end finally came in April and May of 1945 when the Soviet offensives against Berlin and Prague destroyed what remained of the German forces, at last bringing the 4-year conflict to a resolution. We now turn our attention to the question of assessing the number of casualties incurred by the combatants on the Eastern Front. This question is still controversial, as it has implications for narratives about the effectiveness of German and Soviet armed forces, which played an important role in the self-image of both Western and Soviet militaries during the Cold War and into the present day. In attempting to arrive at as accurate as possible answer to this question, it will be useful to outline 3 key principles of historical statistics, which inform both the estimates I use here as well as the manner I collect and process this information. First principle, comprehensiveness, relates to the importance of including all relevant data, which covers the entirety of the domain in question. In the case of casualties, this means including not just battlefield dead and missing, which is typically the focus of many statistics, but also those killed in rear areas, from paramilitary organizations, and those who succumb to their wounds. Comprehensiveness is vital for ensuring a fuller picture of the military situation, which is essential for the simulation that I'll present in the next video. The second principle, comparability, relates primarily to ensuring that statistics gathered for both combatants are as similar in definitions and standards of inclusion as possible. One of the primary purposes of gathering statistical data is for purposes of comparison across time between countries, and therefore equivalence of scope, definitions, and methodology is critical for ensuring the validity of such comparisons. Obviously, if 2 countries collect their statistics using very different definitions, it's inappropriate to make a comparison, say, of casualty data on that basis. The third principle, contextualization, involves providing the relevant background details and context needed to appropriately interpret statistics in their historical context. This includes both economic, logistic, political, geographic, and technical factors. Unfortunately, in this short video, I will not be able to provide all of the context that would ideally be necessary. However, I will endeavor to provide sufficient context to enable the statistical data to be meaningfully interpreted. Context also incorporates knowledge of how the statistics were compiled and what they actually refer to. Absent this contextual background information, historical statistics effectively become meaningless numbers. Given these principles, I will now mention some specific issues that must be borne in mind when interpreting casualty data, particularly from the Second World War. First, it is vital to distinguish casualties from deaths, prisoners of war, or POWs, and wounded. Casualty is typically used as an overarching term to include all losses in a military conflict, including dead, missing, prisoners of war, and wounded. In this presentation, I will use the terms losses and casualties interchangeably. Now, this is an overly broad term since it often includes wounded and sick who later are able to return to service. On the other hand, deaths is typically too narrow a term since it excludes those who die from wounds, although this depends on the source as to exactly whether that's included or not, as well as those who are captured by the enemy, so they're not dead, but they are no longer available to that force. Missing is an especially difficult category because essentially it doesn't refer to any actual final state, it refers to a lack of knowledge as to what actually happened to the person. Depending on the context, most missing are typically either dead, whose bodies are simply not identified, or they are prisoners of war. Prisoners of war are often listed under missing since there is never a body, nor is there any real way for a nation to know how many of its soldiers are captured. This is particularly true during instances of surrounding by the enemy forces. You don't know exactly how many soldiers have been surrounded and how many died versus who were eventually captured. Prisoners of war can also subsequently die of disease or maltreatment, which makes it especially important not to double count them if they've been recorded as prisoners of war and then may later be recorded as deaths, especially after the conflict. Wounded is an especially difficult category because different combatants and different forces within a combatant will define wounded differently. Often, frontline units would report wounded as the number of soldiers that need to be sent back from the front to hospitals in the rear for recuperation. Some of these soldiers would, after a period of weeks or months, be able to return to duty, whereas others would be permanently disabled and have to be discharged. Unfortunately, data is not usually available to distinguish between these two cases, and in my estimates, therefore, I must use a number of assumptions to derive plausible but still indirect estimates for these figures. The second principle is that it is always important to clarify exactly which services are included in a given data source. In particular, Army is not the same as Armed Forces, and it is the latter that is most relevant since it provides the most comprehensive picture of the military performance of a combatant. As such, it is critical to ensure that both the German Heer, which was the Army, and the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, are included in casualty data. Typically, all Wehrmacht soldiers are reported in German casualty data, but this needs to be checked carefully against the source. Also, there is a tendency in historical scholarship and popular discussion to use the word Wehrmacht synonymously with the Heer, which was actually just the army. But generally we're interested in all Wehrmacht casualties and personnel, including Air Force, Army, as well as various support services. Now this is less of an issue for the Soviets since their Army Air Force wasn't a separate military branch, it was part of the Red Army. However, a further complication is the existence of units that were technically outside the conventional military hierarchy. This is an issue for the German Waffen-SS, which technically was a separate branch outside of the Wehrmacht. Often its figures are included with the Wehrmacht, but this is not always the case, and so it's important to keep in mind and be aware whether a source includes the Waffen-SS or not, and unfortunately sources are not always clear about this or always consistent. A similar issue, though less severe because of its smaller size, arises with NKVD security units and personnel from within the Soviet Union, which were also technically outside of the Red Army. A third issue relates to the existence of a wide range of reserve, support, and paramilitary forces, casualties of which are typically not included alongside the frontline casualty reports collated by the military high commands of both Germany and the Soviet Union. Such forces include border troops, construction troops, police units who sometimes are engaged in combat, anti-aircraft defense forces, of which there were very large numbers in both Germany and the Soviet Union, as well as partisans. Fourth, it is vital to understand the method by which casualty data have been obtained or constructed. As I mentioned, official casualty reports for Germany and the Soviet Union, as well as for most combatant nations, are constructed by compiling reports sent in periodically by frontline military units, who would report on how many soldiers were dead, missing, and wounded during some period of time, often a week or sometimes a month. However, there are many problems with this method of counting casualties. In addition to ignoring casualties from paramilitary, reserve, and support organizations, as I've just mentioned, this process often leads to undercounting of deaths behind the lines due to wounds and disease, because these soldiers are not actually with their units when they die, and therefore they may or may not find their records incorporated into official casualty data or not. The number of missing soldiers is also often underreported using these methods, particularly during times of military crises when accurate records are not always kept and are hard to keep. And this is especially relevant for the Soviet Union in 1941 and for Germany during the last 10 months or so of the war. Some units at various times only reported the difference between available personnel at the start and the end of a week or a month, and that will naturally lead to underreporting of casualties if, say, the same personnel arrive and then are lost within those two dates, so they will never actually appear in the casualty data. Finally, any records that do not reach the central command or are lost or incomplete for various reasons will never be incorporated into the totals. And quite frankly, during times of military difficulty, it was not always the highest priority of frontline units to accurately record their casualty data and send those reports in a timely fashion to the central military authorities. For all of these reasons, methods based on frontline reports will almost always undercount the true casualties, especially during times of military stress. An alternative method to assess casualties is to use personnel service records for individual soldiers. Now, this is typically not possible during a conflict because there's too much archival work that needs to be done in order to collate them. However, the advantage is that it offers a far more comprehensive picture of casualties, as it enables losses from all causes and all branches of the military to be included. Data from these sources is my preferred basis for the casualty estimates that I use, as I'll discuss in a moment. A third method to estimate casualties is to use demographic methods. This usually involves calculating the demographic losses due to the war, basically by comparing populations before and after the conflict and factoring in natural demographic change that would be expected due to births and natural deaths during that period. To then determine the casualties due to the war specifically, one can examine the demographic loss between men and women, since military losses are overwhelmingly male. This is not a perfect method, as it's a subtractive process, and so we tend to overestimate the number of losses. That is, the assumption is that any difference in the demographic discrepancy between before and after the conflict is attributed to losses due to the conflict, which is not necessarily the case. There could be changes of other sorts that lead to differences in casualties. Nevertheless, it does present an upper bound on the expected losses due to the conflict. Ideally, what we would like is for the demographic estimate to be similar to or slightly higher than the calculation based on personnel service records, which in turn we expect to be significantly higher potentially than the totals calculated by the Central Military Authority, owing to the issues that I mentioned previously. A fifth and final point to consider in the case of the German data is whether all fronts are included or only the Eastern Front. For purposes of this investigation and this video series, I'm only interested in the Eastern Front, and so all data must be adjusted or disaggregated to only refer to the East. In some cases, particularly in 1945, when the fronts sort of merged to converge on the German homeland, only crude estimates of this are available. For my purposes, the Eastern Front is defined to include all German military action in the east from Finland down to the Black Sea, but excluding operations against partisans in Yugoslavia or Greece. Soviet operations in Manchuria in August of 1945 are also outside the scope of this investigation. Now, although technically those losses are included in the wartime losses that I give for the Soviet Union, the numbers are so small as to be negligible and well within the boundaries of error on Soviet losses anyway. As a result of these considerations, we arrive at a crude formula for the total permanent losses of a combatant in a conflict, which is that the total permanent losses is equal to the deaths plus the prisoners of war, who are obviously no longer available for military service, plus those who are wounded or permanently disabled sufficiently so as to be discharged from the military. This is the figure that I will use and how I will refer to total losses or total casualties going forward. Now we can begin with the process of considering how we can determine the total military losses of the Soviet Union in the Second World War, bearing in mind that here I'm only discussing military losses, not civilian losses. Some viewers may have heard the figure of 8.7 million Soviet deaths on the Eastern Front in World War II. This figure, as well as virtually all casualty data from the Soviet Union, derives from a comprehensive analysis of Soviet wartime reports that was completed from the late 1980s to early 1990s, headed by Russian military historian Georgy Krivosheyev. The source I predominantly used is a slightly updated version of these data published in 2010, which is titled, as you can see here, the English translation being The Great Patriotic War, Book of Losses. The numbers that are cited sometimes vary slightly between the source that is used depending on whether it's this updated version or the earlier original publication which came out in the 1990s, though the differences are relatively minor compared to the issues we will discuss here. Now, despite being widely used by military historians, the Krivosheyev data are fundamentally flawed. This table here illustrates some of the major issues in the 8.7 million figure that he provides, bearing in mind that Krivosheyev constructed these estimates based on aggregation of reports from frontline units, and therefore are subject to the various problems that those data sources face. Now, first here, examining this table, we notice that Krivosheyev excludes 500,000 reservists who were killed during the German offensives of 1941 before being formally registered with their units. Krivosheyev maintains that these should be included with the civilian casualties, but virtually every commentator disagrees on this point and adds these to military losses. And from my point of view, there seems little reason to include these with the civilian losses since they were reservists who were killed in action while at the front or on their way to the front. Second, Krivosheyev provides a drastically low account for the number of Soviet prisoners of war compared to the Germans, and particularly the number of dead prisoners of war compared to the figures we have from the Germans. Krivosheyev gives 4.4 million Soviets captured, mostly in 1941, compared to the German figure of 5.8 million. Krivosheyev argues that the difference is accounted for by civilians that the Germans captured and just sort of rounded up as part of their large encirclements during Operation Barbarossa. Again, many scholars find this explanation dubious, and Krivosheyev seems to have little evidence to support this claim. It may be the case that large numbers of non-combatant personnel and rearguard and support personnel were captured by the Germans, but by the principle of comprehensiveness, these should be included anyway, as long as they were uniformed military personnel. Furthermore, it is implausible that the Germans would have taken large numbers of civilians that didn't have any role in the armed forces into captivity, as the Germans made very few preparations to accommodate the millions of Soviet prisoners that they took in 1941. They regarded these as a burden and often left them in large fields to starve to death. It's therefore unclear why they would add to this burden by taking civilians as prisoners. As such, I regard Krivosheev's explanation for the discrepancy as implausible and use the larger figure of dead prisoners of war from the German figures. A third issue with Krivosheev's figures is that some of the categories he uses, such as those discharged from the armed services during the war, themselves include large numbers of dead. These include those who died in prison, those who were sentenced to death, and all those who died in penal battalions. My estimate for the total number of dead included in the discharge category is about 760,000, which is a significant number that should be included in Soviet dead in the war. Making just these adjustments, that is, the dead reservists, the increased deaths from prisoners of war, and those who died in prison, in penal battalions, or were executed, plus adding a small number of dead NKVD and border troops not included in Krivosheev's original data, revised the total number of deaths from 8.7 million up to 11.5 million, far in excess of the 8.7 million figure that Krivosheev gives in his account. It should be noted that Krivosheyev must make the choices he does in excluding so many categories of deaths, because otherwise the underlying casualty data he is working with yield inconsistencies that cannot be reconciled. Aggregating the reports that he receives from individual military operations, as he does in his book, he arrives at a figure of 8.7 million, and therefore he feels obliged, it seems, to use aggregate data, that is adding up personnel data, to reach the same figure. However, as we've discussed, this approach is fundamentally flawed, as military casualties will always be greater than reported by frontline units, especially when considering the often lackluster reporting ability and administrative capability of the Soviet military, particularly during the chaotic period of 1941. Now, these inconsistencies and problems have been noted by a large number of scholars, particularly Russian scholars, including Lev Lupokovsky, Boris Sokolov, Sergei Mikhailev, David Glantz, and Anvar Ismailov. These are among the scholars that I've drawn from in compiling this information. The table here provides an alternative way of considering the data in which Krivosheyev attempts to account for all Soviet personnel by their final status at the end of the war. In doing so, however, Krivosheyev makes major errors which lead to inconsistencies in the way he treats the data. Again, I believe that these errors are made in service of arriving at an 8.7 million figure for the overall Soviet casualties, which he desires in order to match the figure that he arrives at by aggregating losses reported from frontline units, even though, as noted, we would not expect these to be equivalent. Looking at this table, therefore, the first issue we see is in accounting for those discharged during the war. Krivosheyev gives us this number as 9.7 million. However, he also notes that 1.3 million of these were later reconscripted into the Soviet army. Now, this 1.3 million should therefore not be included as discharged during the war, since that was not their final status. Their final status will be either in the armed forces at the end of the conflict, or dead or possibly taken prisoner, not discharged and then reconscripted. That isn't a final state. A second major issue is that Krivosheyev includes in final status 940,000 missing in action, shown in row G here, who were later found in recovered territories and reconscripted. So these were Soviet recruits who were initially reported MIA but were later found and then reincorporated into the Red Army. Again, the problem with this is that this is not a final status. Again, the only final statuses should be in the armed services at the end of the war, discharged during the war and not reconscripted, dead, or returned prisoners of war. Having been initially declared MIA and later reconscripted is not a final status. That's something that is a transitory state that occurs during the conflict. It is important to realize that these aren't 940,000 specific persons that are known and identified. Rather, this is a total number of people that was known to be found after having been declared MIA, which then Krivosheyev adds into the data as a final status. This is misleading because it is not a final status. The only reason I can think of for their inclusion as a separate final status, therefore, is to ensure that the aggregate numbers balance. Making the adjustments to this table, therefore, to remove this inconsistent accounting reveals that Krivosheyev's data failed to account for about 2 million Soviet personnel. There is a difference of about 2 million between the final status that are accounted for using Krivosheyev's data and the total of 34.4 million mobilized that he uses. In combination with the omissions discussed previously, I believe that this constitutes evidence that Krivosheyev's data grossly underestimate the number of Soviet casualties, including the number of Soviet deaths. In particular, casualties from outside frontline military forces do not appear to be included at all in Krivosheyev's deaths, although they are included in the total numbers of personnel that he refers to. This point is repeated by Michael Ullman and S. Maksudov in their article Soviet Deaths in the Great Patriotic War. And I quote from them, "It is important to note that this figure of 8.7 million only includes the regular armed forces and the frontier troops and internal troops of the NKVD. It does not include non-conscripted fighters, partisans, resistance fighters in the underground in territories occupied by the Germans, nor does it include railwaymen fighting in their own militarized detachments, local anti-aircraft defense, the militarized fire service, police in frontier areas who fought against the invaders, etc." To arrive at a more comprehensive figure for Soviet losses, therefore, I believe we should turn to a data source that has recently become available from an analysis of Soviet servicemen records. Anvar Ismailov reports on this. Quote, Immediately after the war and until 1949, military commissars made so-called house rounds. That is, they made the rounds of homes with personal inquiries of relatives of those front fighters who did not return from the war for the purpose of exposing persons missing in action. Servicemen recorded in this way comprised 60% of the card index of losses, end quote, which was a central index of records of all Soviet personnel lost in the conflict. A recent analysis and consolidation of these index cards has been conducted after the opening of the Soviet archives, and Ismailov sums up the results of this here. Quote, losses among the rank and file and non-commissioned officers were 12.4 million, naval officers 1.1 million, and naval personnel 150,000, internal troops 97,000, and border troops 61,000, in all sum to 13.8 million. These data refute individual researchers who cite overall losses as 11.9 million, of whom 6.8 died and 4.5 were captured and or missing in action. End quote. And those two final figures there are references to Krivosheev's numbers that we've just been discussing. Another approach can be used to corroborate this much higher estimate of Soviet losses. Using data from post-war Soviet population records, we find here highlighted in yellow the population deficit of working-aged men and women from 1946 compared to 1941 before the conflict. The difference between these two values can reasonably be taken as a rough estimate of all military losses, and this amounts to 13.2 million. As a result of these considerations, I estimate the total number of Soviet military losses during World War II as approximately 13 million. I believe the much lower number of around 9 million given by Krivosheev is not credible, as it relies on an additive method of front-line reports that is known to systematically underreport casualties, especially during the chaotic period of 1941. In addition to using this method, Krivosheev also uses dubious techniques to ensure that his figures balance by excluding numbers that should be included and subtracting about 2 million from the final number of Soviet personnel by the end state at the end of the war, when in fact the classifications that he gives do not constitute an end state. Interested viewers can consult the further references provided in the method notes in the document contained in the video description for a fuller discussion of these issues. We now turn to an examination of the German casualties, and thankfully the matter is rather simpler in this case, as a comprehensive series of monthly estimates is available thanks to the work of German historian Rüdiger Overmans. His estimates are based on a representative sample of personnel files taken from the Wehrmacht records. So this is effectively a similar approach that has been taken by the analysis of the Soviet personnel index cards in recent years, although unfortunately in the latter case it seems that no representative sample and monthly personnel loss figures have been yet constructed. Overmans, for the German cases, estimates that 5.3 million German military personnel died during the war, of whom about 3.7 million were killed on the Eastern Front. This is significantly higher than the official estimates provided by the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, which is the central agency responsible for collating these figures, the discrepancy being due to many of the issues discussed previously. In particular, Overmans argues that the Wehrmacht casualty reporting system progressively broke down during the chaotic retreats of late 1944, and thus casualties from especially the final year of the war are particularly underreported. Now, putting together the German and the Soviet data, we can arrive at an overall picture of the military casualties of the major combatants on the Eastern Front. In this table, I present a comparison of the official, that is the OKW data for Germany and the Krivosheev data for the Soviet Union, numbers against my preferred estimates. From these numbers, it is clear that the overall ratio of Soviet to German deaths, as well as casualties, is quite similar in both datasets, slightly more than 3-to-1 in the official data and slightly less than 3-to-1 in my preferred data. I emphasize these points because I'm concerned that some will accuse me of attempting to inflate Soviet casualties based on the adjustments I make to Krivosheev's figures. However, as I have argued, these adjustments are well motivated by clear methodological problems in Krivosheev's numbers, and serve to make the Soviet figures comparable to the all-inclusive personnel record-based figures provided by Overmans. This point must be very strongly emphasized, namely that it is inappropriate to compare Overmans' data to Krivosheev's data, as some have done in this discussion, because doing so violates the principle of comparability. Overmans' data is derived from analysis of personnel records and thus serves as an inclusive, all things considered measure of all deaths of military personnel, including rearguard and paramilitary units from all causes during the conflict. By contrast, Kurvasier's numbers are based on reports of frontline units only and exclude all of these additional deaths, or at least most of them. Overmann's figures are thus most appropriately compared to the data found by examining Soviet personnel records, which is what I base my rough estimate of 13 million on. Ideally, a statistical analysis of the Soviet personnel data would be undertaken using the same methodology as Overmann's did for the German data. That would provide us with a more accurate and comparable Soviet series and more precise data for comparative purposes. Unfortunately, even 80 years on from the end of the conflict, this scholarly work still remains to be done. Looking now at national totals for all combatants, we see that after the 13 million Soviet deaths and the 3.7 million German deaths, Romania and Hungary each suffered around 400,000 deaths. Italy is next on the list at about 90,000 deaths, followed by Finland, 63,000, Poland, 40,000, and then Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Spain with 5,000 to 10,000 deaths each. This amounts to a grisly total of 17.7 million, or rounding for the degree of imprecision in Soviet deaths, which could easily be a few 100,000 either way, we get a rough total of 18 million military deaths on the Eastern Front. This is about 375,000 for every month of fighting, or over 12,000 deaths every single day on average over 4 years. The human mind is simply not equipped to fully comprehend such numbers. To provide a modern comparison which may aid in grasping the sheer scale of such losses, in 20 years of fighting in Afghanistan, the total coalition dead, including contractors but not including their Afghan allies, amounted to just under 8,000. Thus, each day on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union itself suffered more deaths than did the entire coalition in 2 decades fighting in Afghanistan. This grisly figure is further represented by this pie chart here showing the breakdown of deaths by combatant nation, showing that the Soviet Union incurred about 3/4 of all deaths on the Eastern Front, with Germany accounting for about 20% and the minor nations of particularly Hungary and Romania accounting for the remainder. We now turn our attention to examining the losses in more detail. This graph shows losses by month from the start of the conflict until the very end of the war. Interested viewers should consult the linked document where I describe in more detail exactly how I constructed this monthly series. Losses are disaggregated to show German, Soviet, and minor powers separately. Readily evident here are the tremendous losses borne by the Red Army during 1941. Casualties fell during 1942 but remained very high throughout the remainder of the war. German losses were already substantial even during Barbarossa. And aside from a huge spike as a result of a defeat in Stalingrad, they remained reasonably constant at high but not catastrophic levels until the middle of 1944, when they ballooned owing to the beginning of Operation Bagration on the Eastern Front. The losses of minor nations were relatively modest by comparison, with the exception of tremendous Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian losses at Stalingrad, which is shown in the months of November 42 through January 43. There is also a spike due to Soviet offensives which knocked Finland, Romania, and Bulgaria out of the war around June to August of 1944. It is now time to consider the relative strengths of the German and Soviet forces on the Eastern Front over the course of the conflict. The figures I present here are estimates of the total number of regular military personnel at the front, including both combat and non-combat troops, regardless of whether they're immediately fit for duty. Irregular and paramilitary forces and wounded sent to rear hospitals are not included. The primary source for these figures is Germany and the Second World War, volume 5.2 for the German figures, and Kurvasiev for the Soviet figures. Historian David Glantz also provides a similar set of figures at the end of his book, which are broadly comparable though not identical to those I use here. Sufficient information will likely never be available to ensure that these figures are precisely consistent or entirely complete across both combatants and for all months of the war. However, as far as I can tell, the criteria used between the two nations are broadly consistent. That is, total frontline strength of all personnel at the front, irrespective of whether they're combat or non-combat personnel and irrespective of whether they're immediately fit for duty. As such, I believe the margin of error for most months is on the order of 5% or so, though the figures for the final months of the war in the case of Germany are especially inaccurate, as we have very little data from that period. Now, immediately evident looking at this graph is the substantial increase in the Soviet strength from 3 million to 6 million over the course of late 1941 to late 1942. Thereafter, Soviet strength held roughly constant in the range of 6 to 7 million, with a little bit of variation over the course of the conflict. During the final 10 months or so of the war, Soviet strength was progressively augmented by Allied troops, particularly those from Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland. Germany began the campaign in the east with over 3 million personnel, and as well as almost 1 million more from its minor allies, particularly Finland and Romania. By late 1941, this had fallen to slightly below 3 million as a result of losses as well as the withdrawal of most of the Allied forces. This level of around 3 million, give or take, was maintained roughly until the Kursk offensive of July 1943, after which point Germany progressively reduced its strength in the east, which gradually fell to a mere 1.5 million by the end of hostilities. The contribution of Germany's allies was very inconsistent, with peaks during the initial phases of Barbarossa owing to, as I mentioned, the Romanian and Finnish contributions, and another peak during middle to late 1942 owing to large contributions from Romania, Hungary, and Italy to the invasion of the Caucasus, and another peak in mid-1944 due to mobilization of Hungarian and Romanian forces in defense of their homelands from Soviet invasion during those months. However, the contributions of Germany's minor Axis partners, as is indicated here, depended largely on the political willingness of their governments to commit forces, and not primarily on overall strategic considerations, with the Germans putting increasing pressure on them to contribute more forces from 1942 onwards. Comparing this graph here to the losses graph that we previously looked at, you may notice that there is a close association between the two figures. That is, as German strength on the Eastern Front fell over the course of the war, the loss ratio became more and more favourable to the Soviet Union. We can visualize this more clearly on a graph in which we show the loss ratio explicitly against the strength ratio. Here, the loss ratio is shown as bars in each month, and the strength ratio is shown as a line varying over the course of the conflict. Apart from a few outliers, in particular those corresponding to the German defeat at Stalingrad in November through January, 42 through 43, the inverse relationship between these two ratios is very visually compelling. Now we can get an even more accurate view of the performance of the German military specifically if we exclude the minor Axis nations and look only at the plot for Germany and the Soviet Union, as shown here. The overall trend is similar, except there's less of a sharp decline for Stalingrad, though January 1943, when the Germans surrendered at Stalingrad, still stands out as an outlier. And we also see a more gradual build-up of Soviet numerical superiority near the end of the war, having not included Bulgarian and Romanian troops. From this graph, we can also see that, aside again from January 1943, Soviet losses do not fall noticeably or consistently below the level of twice German losses until around June of 1944. And from that point on, from the remainder of the war, Soviet losses on average were about on par with the Germans. However, in order to achieve this level of parity in overall losses in the last 10 months of the war, the Soviets required a numerical superiority of between 3-1 to 4-1 in their favor. By comparison, when the strength ratios had been close to 1-1 during 1941, the Soviets suffered roughly 10 times the casualties of the Germans. These data strongly suggest a major discrepancy in the overall capability and quality of the Red Army compared to the Wehrmacht in their ability to inflict casualties on the enemy, as well as the major importance to the Soviets of maintaining a significant numerical superiority. To illustrate the importance of Soviet numerical superiority even more clearly, we can plot the logarithm of the loss ratio against the logarithm of the strength ratio. Taking the logarithm is helpful because it allows the relationship to be more linear, which is easier to see visually. Taking data here from 1942 onwards and plotting the curve of best fit, we see that there is a very clear clustering with a strong R-squared value of about 0.75. This means that in the data from April 1942 onwards, about 75% of the variation in the loss ratio between Germany and the Soviet Union is accounted for or explained by variation in the strength ratio between those two combatants. There is a substantial outlier due to Stalingrad, as well as an outlier of a grouping of the months from June 1941 through March 1942. It should be noted that this estimate of an R-squared of 0.75, which again represents the amount of variation explained by the strength ratio, will actually underestimate the strength of the association between these variables owing to measurement error, which tends to suppress R-squares. So the true amount of variation in losses explained by the difference in strength is actually greater than this. Now, some viewers may object to this approach because it may be said that it's unreasonable to reduce all the facets of military performance, including tactics, operational strategy, training, equipment, logistics, planning, terrain, morale, and so on, to just two numbers. Yet the purpose of this exercise here is not to say that these factors don't matter, but rather is that If we fix all of these variables to the values that they had in the actual circumstances at each point in the war, and if we consider only the variation in the ratio of frontline strengths of Germany to the Soviet Union, we find that about 3/4 of the variation in losses can be explained. Now, by itself, this doesn't prove that the increased numerical superiority was the cause of the increased effectiveness of the Soviet military over the course of the war, since there are other factors like improved Soviet operational planning and effectiveness in carrying out these operations, which also correlated with the higher Soviet military strength. And thus, these other factors could be confounding variables. However, I do regard this very close association between strength ratio and loss ratio as highly suggestive evidence, and I contend that it is reasonable to believe that the large majority of the improved effectiveness of the Soviet military, as measured, for example, by their advance against the Germans and the more favorable loss ratio later in the war compared to earlier in the war, is largely attributable to their growing numerical superiority. In particular, apart from the fact that it is simply obvious that having numerical superiority in a war of attrition over the Eastern Front would be highly valuable, and clearly was of great use to the Soviets, there's also the fact that other confounding factors such as improved Soviet training or operational effectiveness would not be expected to correlate so well with the strength ratio and the loss ratio as to confound a large fraction of the association here. As such, I think it's reasonable to infer that a very substantial majority of the improved effectiveness of the Soviet forces, as measured by the loss ratio, was due to their increased strength ratio, that is, their greater numerical superiority over the Germans over the course of the conflict. We can gain further insight into this issue by considering Soviet military performance in terms of equipment losses, not just personnel losses. In this table here, we see an annual comparison of the losses of single-engine fighters, all combat aircraft, armored vehicles, as well as manpower. It is overwhelmingly clear that the Soviets consistently lost far more tanks and aircraft than did the Germans. Overall, on the order of 5-1 for all aircraft and close to 4-1 for armored vehicles, averaged over the entire war. The ratios were generally worst in 1941 and improved over the course of the war, which itself is an indication potentially of improved Soviet operational performance. Nevertheless, these ratios remained consistently unfavorable in the Soviet Union, even in cases where they heavily outnumbered the German forces. For tanks and personnel, there is enough data available to calculate what I call an effectiveness ratio, which here I define as the casualties inflicted per Soviet soldier in a calendar year of combat, divided by the casualties inflicted per German soldier during the same period. This gives a measure of how much each soldier in each army was able to inflict casualties on the opposing force. For roughly evenly matched forces, the value should be around 1. However, as we see here, the value for personnel is less than 0.1 during 1941 and 1942, and rose to only 0.4 in 1945. This means that even in the catastrophic final months of the war, each German soldier was able to inflict more than twice as many casualties as their corresponding Soviet counterpart, despite the fact that the Germans at this stage were outnumbered by 4-1. As a point of comparison, the US-led coalition in the Gulf War inflicted about 100 times as many casualties per soldier as did the Iraqis. On average, over the course of the entire conflict on the Eastern Front, Germany inflicted 6 times as many casualties per soldier as did the Soviets. The ratio is even more extreme in the case of tanks, where the overall ratio for the war is about 10 times as many tank kills per German tank compared to kills per Soviet tank. The poor performance of Soviet tanks is further illustrated in this figure of monthly losses of Soviet and German tanks. This shows that despite outnumbering the Germans on average of 3-1 in tanks from 1943 onwards, although there is some fluctuation, monthly loss ratios in tanks rarely fell below 2-1, even up to early 1945. Again, this indicates that tank for tank, the Soviets performed far worse than the German counterparts. The overall conclusion I draw from this data is that despite the undoubted improvements in Soviet operational proficiency over the course of the war, they never even came close to matching the proficiency of the German military on a man-to-man, tank-to-tank, or plane-to-plane basis. The tremendous success of the Red Army, particularly in the final 2 years of the war, was predominantly due to overwhelming numerical superiority, especially in tanks and artillery. This is further illustrated in 2 specific cases by figures that I will show here, which are taken from Germany in the Second World War, Volume 8. On the left is a depiction of the relative forces at the Battle of Kursk in July of 1943. On the right, a depiction of the situation at the beginning of Operation Bagration in June of 1944. In both cases, the enormous superiority of Soviet men and materiel is clear, with ratios of between 3 and 5 to 1 in 1943 and 4 to 10 to 1 in the 1944 battle. Note that there is a misprint in the right-hand figure in the ratio of tanks, as is clear from the numbers presented. It should be 1 to 23, not 1 to 2.3. Of course, operational examples such as this must be interpreted with caution, and that is indeed why I don't typically use them in my analysis, although I present them here for illustrative purposes. Because these only refer to the number of troops and materiel available initially at that particular region of the front. Also, deployment of troops and equipment in the right place at the right time so as to be able to attack where the enemy is weakest is a critical aspect of military operations, one that the Soviets repeatedly proved themselves to be very adept at, as the case of the Moscow counteroffensive in 1941, the Stalingrad counteroffensive and encirclement in 1942, the Battle of Kursk in 1943, and Operation Bagration in 1944 all show. Nor do I in any way wish to demean or impugn the fighting spirit or tenacity of the Soviet soldier individually. Rather, what I'm attempting to illustrate with these data is that at the grand strategic level, abstracting from the details of specific operations, the evidence points to the fact that Soviet success was contingent on substantial numerical superiority of men and equipment, on the order of at least 3 to 1 in most cases. Even with such superiority, the Soviets continued to suffer greater casualties than the Germans until the last 10 months of the war, and greater losses of equipment, particularly tanks and aircraft, until the very end of the conflict. The view that I present here runs somewhat counter to recent trends in Western scholarship, which has tended to emphasize Soviet military successes and German military failures, and express some skepticism to the view, particularly commonly found in the memoirs of German generals after the conflict, that German defeat in the East was due primarily to German numerical inferiority combined with Hitler's meddling. My claim is that these accounts, while serving as an important counter to the overly simplistic and self-serving claims of the German memoirs, nonetheless fail to appreciate the immense importance of the Soviet numerical superiority. And a large reason for this is because hitherto there has not been a sufficient emphasis on comprehensive, comparable overall statistics of strength and casualties over the course of the conflict. Nor has there been sufficient effort to contextualize figures when they are given. In particular, the fact that loss ratios show such a strong correlation with strength ratios, again explaining at least 75% of the variation, is, I believe, a novel finding that has not been reported before, and illustrates the value of taking a statistical approach to address these historical questions. Too often, historians will provide statistics for an individual operation or a particular army without giving a clear indication of how these fit into a broader picture, and especially how the numbers compare between the combatants. For example, if German forces were under strength in a particular operation, or if Germany managed to build up their forces in a particular operation, that's only of relevance if we can compare it to the state of the Soviet forces in the same operation, because military operations and success therein are inherently comparative. It doesn't matter if you have 1 million men if the other guy has 3 million men. What matters is the ratio of those forces and the relative effectiveness. Authors also often point to improved Soviet operational performance in the second half of the war as being especially important. And while this is certainly a factor, frequently no effort is made to adjust for the substantial increase in numerical superiority enjoyed by the Soviet Union in, say, 1944 compared to 1941. One cannot claim that Soviet performance improved dramatically from 1941 to 1944 without factoring in that in 1941 the Soviets fought roughly at 1-to-1 level in terms of overall strength ratio to the Germans, whereas in 1944 the ratio was more like 3-to-1 in the Soviet favor. Obviously, performance is going to be much better when you're fighting at 3-to-1 strength ratio compared to 1-to-1 ratio, and this has to be considered when assessing the overall effectiveness of the Soviet armed forces in World War II. By constructing a comprehensive dataset for the entire Eastern Front, I hope to shed greater light on these questions in a way that was not previously possible. In the next video, I will continue my analysis by presenting a novel computational simulation of the Eastern Front to answer the question as to whether Germany could realistically have defeated the Soviet Union even after the failure of Operation Barbarossa. I will also use this model to draw conclusions about which factors were most critical in the German defeat in the East. I will reserve my final conclusions and overall summary until the end of that video. So please check that out. There's a link to that you should be able to see on screen now. And once again, if you would like to investigate in more detail the methods and sources I used for constructing these estimates, please see the file linked to in the video description.